In AD 51, the Christian apostle Paul came to Athens, talking about Jesus and resurrection. Some mocked these strange ideas, and some believed. Today, Paul's writings give us the story of Jesus, alongside the biographies known as the Gospels. But are these reliable historical sources or legends? And could they have been changed? Those are big questions.
Last time we saw respected historians like Tacitus and Josephus confirm that Jesus of Nazareth existed and was executed, and that belief in his resurrection spread around the Roman Empire. These non-Christian writers independently back up key details from the Gospels. This time we'll ask how seriously we should take the Christian historians, Paul and the Gospel writers, and whether their writings could have been changed.
We have different versions of the same story in the New Testament. So somebody's changing the stories, and almost certainly people are making up stories as well.
We have more details about Jesus' words close up than we'd have of Alexander the Great. So I think you can actually know an awful lot about Jesus.
Some say we're accidents in a universe born by chance. Some say we're children of God. I'm Grenville Kent, a Christian academic, and the new atheists have got me questioning my faith. So I'm going wherever the questions take me, with my ever-curious son, Marcus, and talking to leading thinkers on both sides of the God question. Because I really want the evidence. Is there a God? And will I ever find a hat that fits? Paul spoke and wrote about Jesus, but was it credible history or myth?
This is the Athens Agora, or marketplace, where you could come for gossip or the latest news, or to hear a philosopher speak for money, like a busker. And Paul presented a controversial idea: afterlife. Some Greek thinkers didn't believe in afterlife, just the scattering of the atoms of the body. Some saw the soul living on, but Paul was talking about something different: anastasia, literally standing up again, the resurrection of the body.
Philosophers heard Paul and invited him to talk about these new ideas at a private meeting of the religious council, the Areopagus.
Paul's proof of resurrection was his account of Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish man, which must have made the Greeks wonder about foreign gods. Paul had been a rabbi and had persecuted Christians until he said Jesus appeared to him in a vision. After that, he had carefully investigated eyewitness reports of the resurrection of Jesus. Paul had interviewed these witnesses personally. Some of Paul's highly educated audience were open to hearing more evidence, but some instantly mocked, which is understandable if you don't believe in the supernatural.
Professor Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar, but doesn't believe in God.
Some of his followers said that on the third day he got raised from the dead. And they believed that he was alive again, and they started convincing other people that Jesus had come to life again, and people became convinced that Jesus was the Son of God, and slowly this movement started acquiring followers as people would tell stories about Jesus and especially about his death and resurrection.
So why did Paul come to believe? It's not like telling the story of Jesus made him rich or popular. It destroyed his career as a rabbi, and it made him some serious religious and political enemies. He writes, "I've been imprisoned, beaten countless times, often in danger of death." But he kept telling it.
What do you do with someone like a Paul, who opposed Christianity, knew what the arguments were against it, and then completely flips over to the point where he's willing to give his life for that? There's something going on that was very, very profound with Paul, just as there was something going on with the other apostles. You know, they left their normal lives and their vocation to take the message of the gospel literally to the ends of the earth.
This is Dionysius the Areopagite Street, named for one of the first council members to become a Christian, along with a woman named Damaris and others. I wonder what convinced them. It can't have been scientific evidence, because you can hardly repeat a resurrection under laboratory conditions. It must have been historical evidence, the use of credible eyewitness sources. And that's what our courts and journalists use today.
And Paul had researched the eyewitnesses who had seen Jesus.
It's clear that he had a profound experience of Jesus, but what's important is that his experience of this profound sense of the presence of Jesus was not his alone. He shared it with the apostles who walked and talked with Jesus. He interacted with them.
The apostles were threatened with death for telling their story of Jesus, but they kept telling it.
I might die for something I believe in. I might die for something I believe in that's a mistake, but I'm not going to die for something I believe in that I made up. So from that standpoint, it seems to me very, very unlikely that what you're dealing with is something made up. You're dealing with something that's real, and then people make a judgment about whether they believe it or not. If you're going to talk about the resurrection being made up, you've got to explain the appearance to 500 that Paul alludes to. He says some of whom are still alive today.
One of the most interesting historical questions about the New Testament is where the Gospels got their information from. One of them actually gives us a clue about what his sources were. He says there have been traditions that have been handed down by eyewitnesses and people who are proclaiming the word, and that many people on the basis of these reports have written out an account of Jesus' life. Luke says that he's had access to these earlier accounts, and now he's going to give an accurate version.
You're dealing with the memory of eyewitnesses who are passing on the stories of what they experienced that were probably pooled together. We're mostly in a literate culture. A lot of people don't write. It was passed on orally. It was stories of Jesus were told in the context of the service over and over and over and over again, and people got what the core story was.
And these Gospels are usually dated toward the end of the first century. Mark, probably the first Gospel around the year 70. Matthew and Luke, maybe 10 or 15 years later, around 80 to 85. And John around the year 90. So they're separated from the life of Jesus by between 40 and 60 years.
And the reason it takes a while for the Gospels to be written isn't because people are making things up, but you're beginning to lose your living witnesses, the people who could pass it on, the people whose experience you were talking about. You only do that as your people start to die off. And in the ancient world, we know from citations that we have, Eusebius cites Papias, who makes this point explicitly. I preferred to hear the living voice rather than to read something in a book. So once you start to lose those living voices, then you want to record and remember what it is that they said and taught. Thus you get the Gospels.
The great Aristotle said there are three parts to our beliefs: our logos, or intellect, our pathos, or emotion, and our ethos, or social relationships. And these first converts in Athens must have seen hard reasons to believe in Jesus' resurrection. They must have seen the emotional benefit in believing in an afterlife in bliss. That's easy. And they must have seen something in Paul that they trusted, that his belief in resurrection had affected him.
The earliest written account of Jesus' resurrection was in Paul's letter to Corinth, a big, rich trading city on the land bridge between the Greek mainland and the islands.
This is the main road up from the harbour, and Paul came here determined, he says, to focus his public speaking on one thing: the cross of Jesus. I wonder how people heard that here in the main market square, the Agora, where they've come to shop at one of the high-end retail outlets along this side or the other, maybe worship at one of the many beautiful temples up the far end, or to hear some public speaker like Paul in a quiet corner or from the main rostrum up there. He's going to tell them that God was rich but made himself poor on the cross so that we could have his wealth of goodness and eternal life.
And Paul writes that most people here saw this as foolishness. God executed by torture? Shameful.
The imperial temple has to be in the highest place because Rome always dominates. But Paul's going to talk about a God who comes down to save people, who humbles himself, serves like a slave, and even sacrifices his life on a Roman cross. Everyone knew crucifixion meant shame and agonizing death, but the resurrection adds the happy ending of a man who beats death and lives forever. And the Corinthians would have heard hope in that. In fact, Paul says without the resurrection, what he preaches is useless.
What did Paul tell the church in Corinth about Jesus?
He told them a lot while he was with them in Corinth, but what we can also see is from his letters, because we got 2 of his letters that he wrote to the church in Corinth, and from one of them, he actually talks about how Jesus rose from the dead and more than 500 people saw him risen from the dead, and that most of those are still alive and you can actually talk to them. He's probably writing around the middle of the 50s. The crucifixion happens around the year 30, maybe 33. It's not a really long time afterwards, and yet he has also said, I've been preaching this message to you right from the beginning. It's what I also received from other people. So in other words, it goes right back to when Paul first became a Christian, which is only a few years after the crucifixion. And so the basic Christian message about Jesus having died for our sins and then being raised again, Paul says it was established right from a very early stage.
I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also.
But was this just a fairy tale for gullible people who didn't get science yet?
When you look within the Gospels, you can actually see signs that they're not easily fooled. For instance, in the resurrection accounts, people see Jesus and they're wondering whether they've seen a ghost. They're actually not expecting to see Jesus risen from the dead because they know that dead people don't rise. That's their experience. So, in other words, it's not portrayed as they immediately believed. In fact, Matthew, at the end of Matthew, it says that some of the disciples doubted. That's 4 verses from the end of the Gospel. Luke's Gospel, Jesus appears to them and he says, why did doubts arise in your mind? John's Gospel, he has to tell Thomas to stop doubting. These are all people doubting as at the very time when they're seeing Jesus. It doesn't portray them as easily taken in. Obviously, there can be a gullibility towards miracles in a pre-scientific context. In every age, people have to test things. But I think there was enough evidence to convince rational people that it really was true.
Christianity was seen as foolish by many, like this early Roman graffiti artist. Key eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection were women.
Another reason why it's not fabricated, I think, is the fact that you have women at the beginning of the testimony to begin with, because culturally, women didn't count as witnesses. This is actually a very, very important point. Think about this. You're selling an idea that the culture doesn't believe, a physical resurrection. And so someone comes up with the bright public relations idea of, I know what we'll do. We'll sell this difficult idea, and the first people we'll get as witnesses are people who don't count culturally as witnesses. It's just not a very credible scenario.
Can we believe a history with miracles in it?
In terms of Jesus' own miracles, I think it makes far more sense to explain why there was a popular Jesus movement, why lots of people wanted to follow him, and why eventually people were willing to lay down their lives for him. If you have that miraculous element, if you have something like the resurrection, I can explain why lots of people followed Jesus, why lots of people claimed that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead in all sorts of different circumstances. I find it really difficult to explain that without those sorts of miracles.
We talked to Professor Bart Ehrman, and he said that Jesus was a teacher and people added miracles to his story later.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting point of view. Why not say that he was a miracle worker and people added the teachings later? I mean, why would you put one in order before the other? They're in the same historical record. Presumably what allows him to think that one thing comes earlier and another thing comes later is essentially worldview. Jesus as a miracle worker is discussed in Jewish sources, in the Talmud. There's no question there that he performed miracles. It's just the question, what power did he use to perform miracles? That's the question that people are debating.
Why do you take the Gospels as history, not legend?
Well, what sort of legends have you read?
Greek, Roman.
Okay. With a lot of these legends, they're very vague, or they take you off into another world. What you find with the Gospels is that they're really rooted in the time and place that they're supposed to be writing about in terms of the Jewish customs, the geography of the land where Jesus is supposed to have done things. And they're really quite close to the time. So even on the most skeptical dates you might take for the Gospels, and some people might try and push the Gospels into the 2nd century, even on the most skeptical dates, it's not a very big time gap like you have with, I think, the legends and the time they're referring to. So some of the Greek legends, the destruction of Troy and so on, the time gap is a lot bigger.
Let's compare other manuscripts. Plato writes around 400 BC, yet our earliest manuscript is 900 AD, a gap of 1,300 years, and only 7 manuscripts still exist. Julius Caesar writes 50 BC, earliest manuscript 900 AD, gap 950 years, and we only have 10 manuscripts. How do the Jesus manuscripts compare?
Those manuscripts go back and date to within 50 years of the time of the writing in some cases, but we have a ton of ancient evidence. That's in contrast to a lot of ancient works where we might have 1, 2, a dozen, 2 dozen manuscripts, and the gap between writing and manuscript can be 3, 4, 5, 600 years.
Aren't there predictions about the resurrection?
Already within the Old Testament, you have certain texts which fit really well with the resurrection. So there's a famous passage, Isaiah chapter 53, where you have a figure who's described at the end of Isaiah 52 in terms that are only elsewhere used of God. He's high and exalted. And then he suffers in this terrible way 5 different descriptions for this person dying, being put in a grave, crushed, cut off from the land of the living. And then it talks about him surviving and prolonging his days and, things going really well. That sort of passage is not the only one, which fits really well with the resurrection, having a figure die and then do stuff afterwards. And there are those sorts of things in the Old Testament where the resurrection makes sense of them.
Skeptics would say the eyewitness stories were changed in the retelling.
Well, stories that get passed along by word of mouth get changed. And it's quite clear that the stories about Jesus got changed.
The stories of Jesus were passed along orally. Some like to compare it to a game of Chinese whispers. We call it the telephone game, and where someone tells a story, whispers in someone's ear, and it goes down the line until finally at the end, what you have at the end is not like what you had at the beginning. That's what some people compare the transmission process to, but really that ignores the fact that we're dealing with a community process. One of the responsibilities of an apostle is that they had to really know Jesus' ministry, someone who had to have been with Jesus from the beginning. So the 12, who kind of have oversight over what's going on, have a very good knowledge of who Jesus is, and this was one of the qualifications for overseeing that material.
Could Chinese whispers have happened with the Gospels?
There are very, very strict rules for that game. You're only allowed to say the message once, you've got to whisper it, you're only allowed to hear it from one person, and there've got to be enough people to play it. So in other words, you stack all of the initial conditions in order to get a corrupted message. Why would you use that for an analogy for how things began with Christianity? I think a better analogy for Christianity would be karate. Now, are you ever worried that karate is getting corrupted because it's getting taught from one person to another to another? No, because, karate is a discipline, there are checks and balances to make sure that every lesson has been learned properly. So I think that's a far better analogy.
It seems clear to me that Paul's message to Corinth included the death and the resurrection of Jesus from the beginning. It'd be hard to sneak a resurrection into the story later. But some critics have asked, were the original documents copied accurately, or could they have been changed?
As a conservative evangelical Christian, I thought that the words of the Bible had been inspired by God. One of the things that exploded that understanding for me was the realization that we don't have the words of the Bible in many instances. Whatever these authors wrote, we don't have. We don't have their original text, and we don't have copies of those texts, and we don't have copies of the copies of those texts. We have copies that are hundreds of years later. And we do have lots of them. We have thousands of these copies of the New Testament. But the striking thing is that they're all different from one another, sometimes in just a little detail, sometimes in big ways. So this made me think that if God had not gone to the trouble of preserving these words, then what made me think that he had originally inspired these words?
Dr. Ehrman's New York Times best-selling books would discredit the Gospel's reliability. But is there a counter-explanation? So John writes his Gospel here in Ephesus. Churches in other cities want it, and so somebody pays a scribe to make a number of copies by hand. Each of them is recopied, and so tiny mistakes or variants sneak in. Today we have manuscripts from various times and places, and text critics can put them all together into a family tree by looking at the variants.
Well, the manuscript evidence for what we have in the text is strong. We have more manuscripts of the New Testament than we do of any ancient document by miles. We have 5,800 plus Greek manuscripts, over 8,000 Latin manuscripts.
Scholars have never been able to count how many differences there are among these manuscripts. Some scholars say 100,000 differences. More scholars say 200,000 or 300,000. We don't really know.
When you've got as many copies as you have, 5, 6, 8, 13,000, that's actually not all that many differences, and most of those differences are very straightforward. Spelling errors, errors of sight that we can quickly see, the types of things that you see in a typo, for example, that you would quickly be able to figure out what happened. 99% of what you have is obvious and transparent, and actually most people who work with a good Bible are aware of what the differences are because their margins will say or and will signal sometimes what the alternative reading is. So it isn't like we're clueless as to what the options are or what they might mean. But if you could add all those changes up and look at them, they wouldn't change one core doctrine of the Christian faith at all.
We've come to the University of Manchester to see something priceless, the earliest surviving fragment of a gospel, one of the biographies of Jesus.
It records part of Jesus' trial before Pilate, the Roman governor. Jesus says he has come to reveal the truth, and Pilate scoffs. What is truth? That's nearly 2,000 years old. It was written within a century of the events that it describes. We spoke with text critic Dr. Dirk Jongkind.
So what does a text critic do?
A text critic is someone who compares manuscripts, and I see what sort of differences there are, what sort of errors the scribes have made. And by comparing all the manuscripts, I want to get back to the original wording of the New Testament. When John wrote his gospel, he used perhaps parchment or papyrus, but the original, the one that John wrote himself, that one is lost. So we have to rely on the copies that were made of the original gospel. Now, because the New Testament was copied so often, there are lots of manuscripts where scribes, where copyists have made copying errors.
So how confident are you that we have John's original text?
If I look at all the Greek manuscripts we have, then I'm very confident we are very close to the original wording. So yes, I'm confident we have John's gospel as he intended it in the original.
You may feel safer if we had one master copy, maybe on gold plates in a library in Athens or Rome. But that master copy could easily be destroyed by an enemy or edited by a conspiracy. It could be safer to have the copies decentralized. It's a bit like the internet.
They say it began in the Cold War when scientists feared missile attacks and exchanged backups of their work. You could say the New Testament documents have worked in a similar way. The backups can be cross-checked for accuracy. The story of Jesus has gone everywhere, kept alive in isolated places like this when it was under attack, and the Bible is still the bestseller globally year after year. Maybe it's the things he said. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Do to others what you would want them to do to you. Love your enemies. Or what about this one? I am the resurrection and the life.
Whoever believes in me, even though they die, still they will live. Or, the greatest love is to lay down your life for your friends. So many classics. Maybe it's the things he did. Feeding poor peasants, socializing with the underclass, and criminals, and the invading Roman soldiers. Having dinner with screwed up, lonely, rich people. Encouraging mothers and children. Celebrating at a wedding. I've read the stories hundreds of times, and every time he surprises me. To be honest, humbles me, but also encourages. And for me, Jesus is the most magnetic personality I've ever known. Over the last 2,000 years, people have often questioned whether the Jesus stories could be real history. And perhaps that's not surprising. I mean, the idea of God becoming one of us, doing miracles to show his kind intention, dying for our mistakes, and then personally demonstrating the reality of afterlife, that can seem just unbelievable. But there are good reasons to think Paul and the Gospel writers knew their history, based on meticulous research of eyewitness sources and on their own experience. And there's convincing evidence that their writings have been handed down to us accurately, which gives me a solid reason to hope. What do you think?